I actually love the title of this talk because this has been a topic that has been obviously so much in the news, and the way that it's phrased, breaking up the boys club of Silicon Valley, it implies that we can take action. So that will be a fun thing for us to discuss.
We can.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this way.
But let's start, because I thought this was a very appropriate day to be having this talk because Facebook came out this morning with its latest diversity report. And the numbers were, shall we say, had not moved very much in the last couple of years where they've started to talk about this issue of diversity. So my first question to you, Emily, is how much of a boys' club is Silicon Valley?
And by the way, it's the same with Google. They came out with their diversity report a couple of weeks ago, and the numbers had barely budged. They were a bit more transparent about, how they were calculating things, which was nice. But, we are not going to see a real culture shift until the numbers actually change. So I do think that both of those things need to happen. Women today hold 20 to 25% of jobs across the tech industry, and that's the same for big tech companies as it is for startups. It's incredibly egregious when you look at the representation of women among venture capitalists, still about 7 to 8%. And women-led companies get just 2% of venture capital funding. And every time I say that number, I'm just like, oh my God, I cannot believe that women only get 2% of funding in an industry that describes itself as a meritocracy. I hardly believe that women have only 2% of good ideas.
Yeah. And the Facebook numbers, by the way, were that the company has 36% women, which is up from 31% women in 2014. So a long way to go.
And interestingly, when you look at Facebook, if you look at the product organization, the numbers are even worse. And Mark Zuckerberg just did a huge reorg in product, and there were like 20 faces on the page, and one of them was a woman. And I believe, as I understand it, he said something, he addressed it, and he was like, look, I know this doesn't look good. Yeah. But it's hard for me to believe that an organization that's 14 years old at this point hasn't groomed female talent who could be on that org.
So how did it get this way? And the reason you know so much about this is because you've spent a couple of years writing this fantastic book, Brotopia, my favorite title of all time.
Thank you.
And you've been able sort of to look at this larger ecosystem of the tech industry and this issue of the lack of diversity. Well, what are the factors here?
And interestingly, it was the history of how we got here that to me was kind of like the smoking gun. If you go back to the 40s and 50s, women actually played a huge role in early software programming. Men were really the people making the hardware, but women were very well represented among software programmers. And they were programming computers for the military and programming computers for NASA. And it really was like the movie Hidden Figures, but industry-wide. And then in the 60s and 70s, as the industry was starting to explode, tech companies were so desperate for new talent. And this idea that good computer programmers were born and not trained, or born and not made, became ingrained. It sort of was like a black art. Like you either had it or you didn't. And so they started doing these personality tests to identify who might be good at the job. And they decided that good computer programmers don't like people, because that makes sense. And there's no evidence to support the idea that people who don't like people are better at this job than people who do. But it's a characteristic that favors men over women.
And it was men who created these personality tests.
It was two male psychologists who created these personality tests. I mean, they were used by huge tech companies well into the 80s. And in 1984, women actually hit their peak in computer science. They were earning 37% of degrees, and there was about a similar trend in jobs. And that has since plummeted to 18%, where it's been flat for the last decade. So they were there. They were there. They got pushed and profiled out. And those tests created this antisocial male nerd stereotype that persists to this day. And as I was doing my research, so many people who've been in the industry for a long time said to me, oh, movies and television, pop culture, they created this stereotype. But those movies like Revenge of the Nerds and War Games, they all came out after. Yeah. These tests were already being taken. And so I argue that the tech industry created the pipeline problem by having such a narrow idea of who could do this job, which shuts out more than half the population.
So when you were doing your research for this book and other reporting that you're doing around this topic, how did that pipeline problem manifest itself in situations that you encountered, or that women or men that you talked to along the way? I mean, how did this really sort of stand out to you?
Well, first of all, I've made it a point on my show in the last few years to ask CEOs and investors, what are you doing about this? Why are women so underrepresented? What are you doing to hire women or promote women or fund women? And at the end of 2015, I interviewed a very prominent investor in Chapter 5, who they had no women in the US side of the firm at the time. And I said, what are you doing to hire more women? And he said, oh, we're looking very hard, but there's not enough women in the STEM pipeline. And really what we're not prepared to do is to lower our standards. This was on television.
I have to say it on the record that it was Michael Moritz of Sequoia. So, okay.
And honestly, it was almost as if for a moment someone had actually said the truth. People believe, and many men believe, that they have to lower their standards to find qualified women, without thinking about, well, who's creating the standards, and are they wide and inclusive and necessary to do the job that you're actually trying to do. So let's not judge Mike Moritz on this, glib and insensitive remark. Let's judge Sequoia on its actions. Well, up to that point, they had not hired a single woman in their US business for 44 years. You can't tell me you can't find one woman who meets your very high standards in 44 years. So to me, yes, there is a pipeline problem, in part because the tech industry created it, but the industry is reinforcing that problem every single day.
There has been more action lately. The companies have started to self-report their numbers, the Facebook we talked about earlier, Google, and that sort of set off this rash of other companies doing the same, and they're all talking about different ways that they can mend this or change this. What do you think of those efforts?
Look, I think tracking is important and being transparent is important, and I'm sure Facebook didn't enjoy releasing its new numbers today because they knew they didn't look that much better than they did last year. And so I do think that public pressure and holding themselves to account is an important part of the process, but I don't think it's good enough. They've been doing this now for 3 or 4 years, and we've barely seen any movement, and more dramatic change needs to happen at a faster pace. There are some bright spots in the book. In the last chapter, I focus on Slack, which Stuart Butterfield, the CEO, has made it an explicit priority to hire more women and minorities, and every time he tweets about it, they get a spike in inbound interest. So just saying that you care attracts other people who care, and they're punching above the average. I think they're about 43% women, so it's still not 50-50, but it's a lot better than everybody else. Redfin is actually a great example, and I hope I get this right, but in the early days, I believe Bridget was the only female engineer, and the team was 15 people. Am I right on that? Okay, and then as you scaled, you started an organization within the company to train women coming out of boot camps and coming from unconventional backgrounds, and now you're at, what, 32% women in engineering. That's amazing. That's amazing and far better than almost any other company in the tech industry. I do think that companies have an opportunity and an obligation to change more quickly. I recently wrote an op-ed with a couple of colleagues at Business Week about Amazon, which is starting a whole new headquarters somewhere in the country, and they're going to be creating 50,000 new jobs, and there is no reason that those jobs can't be 50-50, men and women. And so we raised that point. We picked the top 3 cities with the best STEM pipelines, where they would have the best chance of success. And I believe that if that was really a top priority for Jeff Bezos, he would make it happen. If they can build rocket ships and speakers in our kitchen and buy grocery stores, they can hire more women.
And what was their response? And which were the top 3 cities, by the way?
Amazon did not comment on the story, but sources tell me that they are actually having conversations with the school systems in the various cities, and it is part of the consideration. Now, are they going to hold themselves to that benchmark? Who knows? When they choose the city, I'm going to be pounding on their door again. But that said, I should mention that since I published the book, and this is something I didn't expect, was that a lot of tech companies have invited me to come speak. Mm-hmm. And they could have easily said, your book is called Brotopia. No, thank you. And Amazon was one of those companies. And so I went up to Seattle and I spoke to a group of Amazon employees, and they're like fired up. They come up to the microphone, and I floated this idea there actually. And actually, one of them came up to the microphone and said, well, that's a great idea, but I'm not the CEO. What can I do? And so, I realize this is a self-selecting audience, but there are people, men and women, who do care and want to make a difference. And I think we're seeing in many different situations that employees are mobilizing now, and they're agitating, and they have more power than ever before. So they can use their voices to make a difference here too.
And what did you tell that person when he said to you, what can I as an individual do to change this situation?
So I think we all need to listen more, and we all need to ask questions of, how are our colleagues doing? I don't think we ask those questions enough, and Sheryl Sandberg wrote a lot about this in Option B, and it sounds cheesy, but bringing your whole self to work, I think it's really important, is creating environments where people feel that they can be authentic and be themselves. And for women in particular, which was my focus, I had 12 women over at my home for dinner 3 weeks after Susan Fowler's blog post, and they were all engineers in tech. 2 of them worked at Uber, Google, Apple. And the prevailing feeling was that because they're often the only woman in a room over and over again, was that they're just exhausted and frustrated, and they feel like they have to do all of this emotional labor that they don't get credit for, and is like an entire second job, just to prove themselves sometimes, to prove that they deserve to be there, and yet they love their jobs. They love their opportunity to do what they're doing, and we have to give them that opportunity. I think mentorship and advocacy is so important, and we all have some bit of power to pass. Susan Wojcicki talks about, you have some power to pass. Like, use that opportunity to find people who have potential. And the other thing is, I think that oftentimes we expect the people who are the victims or the people who aren't getting the opportunity to raise their hand and say, hey, you interrupted me, can you not do that? Or hey, you just mansplained me, I don't appreciate it. But it can be really hard to do that if you're so if you see that happening to someone else, stick up for them, advocate for people. And in general, and this is something that I really saw at Slack, is if you just focus on unconscious bias training or trying to raise awareness about bias, you're not necessarily going to have a huge impact. But if you give employees the tools to combat their bias, that can have an impact. So maybe you don't even start an interview process until you have 2 women and 2 people of color. You are, of course, doing a comprehensive pay review to make sure that people are getting fairly. You have structured interview processes. You have structured review and feedback systems. All of these things help take bias out of the process and make sure that you are seeing a diverse group of candidates.
What about efforts from women in tech themselves? I've been sort of struck by kind of a wave of activism almost by a lot of different women in tech, from the venture capital landscape to the companies. What have you seen on that front?
Well, it's been fascinating, and I'm sure you probably saw this too, just over the course of, I've been doing my show now for 8 years, and I remember in the early days trying to get women to come on the show and talk about the lack of diversity in tech. They did not want to talk about it. They did not want to be the female investor or the female CEO. They just wanted to be the investor and the CEO. And oftentimes I'd ask these same questions, and people would get off the set and just, they were angry, They'd say what they really had to say off camera. And now I see these women just embracing it. They're like, you know what? This is a strength. This is an advantage, and I have an opportunity to change the ratio. And so people like Katrina Lake are, much more outspoken about this. And, investors like Kirsten Green and Aileen Lee. And I think that All Raise, which is this new nonprofit that was founded by 30 different female venture capitalists who are all competitors, by the way, to get more women into VC and more women funded. I think it's huge. And it's so great to see women helping other women, especially since there's this trope that women don't help other women, when in fact the research shows that if there's only 1 woman on the executive team or 1 woman on the board, they are more likely to feel competitive with other women because they think there's only room for 1. But if there's 3, it's completely different. And so that is why the numbers do need to materially change in order to get there.
What about what about talking to young women? I think in your book, at the end of the book, you've talked to like girls who code or learning how to code and so on and so forth. And probably since the book is published, you've probably talked to young women as well.
Yeah.
What kinds of questions are you hearing from them? What kinds of, awareness has this awakened
Well, it's interesting
in them?
because I feel like I'm walking this line between, not describing the industry as this completely hostile place because we want more women to join it, but also making sure that people have their eyes open and are aware. But one of the last things I did before I turned the book in was I interviewed these 7 high school girls who all learned how to code through Girls Who Code. We got burgers at GOTS at the Ferry Building, and they were just so excited about, the path that lie before them and their ability to, their opportunity to change the world. But they also knew, they read the news, like they knew what was going on at Uber. They knew that, Sheryl Sandberg was, the only Sheryl Sandberg, and there are not a lot of women like her. One of the girls was said, I'm in this women in tech group on Facebook, and they talk about being mansplained, and another girl said, yeah, one of the boys said, why isn't there guys who code? And she was like, the entire world is guys who code. They were really sweet. They can't be what they can't see. And so for people in the industry to say, it's not my problem, I didn't create this problem, it's a pipeline problem, not enough girls are studying STEM, that is just a complete abdication of responsibility. Yes, a lot of things need to happen in our culture, in our homes, in our education system, but there's so much more that the industry can do to encourage the next generation of young women to be part of this.
So I'm going to open up to questions right after this. One last question from me, which is, recently the Intel CEO stepped down because of a relationship that he'd had with a subordinate at the company. How much did that signal to you that there's, more of an awareness or thinking about treatment of women in the Valley and how this is a go or no go?
Well, that was an interesting situation because it was a consensual relationship. He is married, but it was not sexual harassment or in the more obvious Harvey Weinstein sense of the word. But I do think it was a different kind of Me Too moment and a sign of corporate America drawing a line. Certainly, an executive having an affair with a subordinate is nothing new and happens all the time. But I think in this day and age, those kinds of things won't be tolerated if they're not disclosed. And I do think there's some really interesting discussions we could have about how to handle relationships at work. But I do think disclosure and transparency is number one. And this is a guy who left $45 million on the table. Like that was a big risk that he took, that he seemed to feel like he could take. And that's not okay. We need the people who are running these companies to be responsible and thoughtful about all of these things. And I realize that we're in a moment where a lot of men are scared and people feel uncomfortable and they don't know what to do. But I think that's okay. For so many decades, it has been one way, and now we're talking about it, and the conversation may be a little bit uncomfortable, but we're going to get to a better place.
And this is why these events are
Yes.
so cool.
Thank you for coming.
Yes. So why don't I open it to questions? There's a microphone coming. Do people?
Hi, Emily. Thanks for joining us. I think you touched on this just in your last answer, but something I've heard recently from men is that they're scared to hire the first woman, or they're not sure how to be themselves when they're so used to the boys' club when a woman joins a team. So what are your thoughts on that and what we could do about that?
Well, being scared to hire the first woman is just stupid. I mean, come on. The bottom line, and I argue this on every page, is that this is good for business. This is good for your company. This is good for you. This is good for our products. This is an industry that's building the future, and we can't have only men making the decisions. So that's number one. And there are plenty of examples in the book. Like I interviewed Dick Costolo, who had just left as CEO of Twitter. He was starting his new thing, and he saw at Twitter how hard it was, in a company that was male-dominated, to try to turn the ship around. Once you get to a certain size, I'm not going to say it's impossible because I'm calling on all of these companies to change, but it's a lot harder to turn the aircraft carrier around. The earlier that you hire a woman, the easier it will be to hire the next woman and to scale that. And one of the things that he said is, we don't now have to like go down the street to do user research. We could just ask the people in the room, oh, what do you think of this feature? And so he was very adamant that he wouldn't hire another man until he hired a woman, and in kind. And so when I first heard that men were scared and less likely to work alone with a woman or travel with a woman, that really made me angry. But at the same time, I do understand that there are plenty of people who do care about this who don't know what to do, and they don't know if they should give you a hug or tell you your dress looks nice. I feel in general that people know where the line is. And when someone feels uncomfortable, that's when a line is crossed, and whatever makes that happen. So we need to create safe places for people to talk about these things, and all of the people who are scared to work alone with women or hire women will feel much better once they actually do and realize that it's pretty awesome.
Hi, Emily. My name's Coco. I work for a blockchain company, and my question is, what do you see the role of women in the blockchain space? It's such a new, up-and-coming space where women have the opportunity to sort of get in on the ground floor with the rest of the men. I want to hear your thoughts on how women can further themselves in this, how they can get ahead or maybe sort of equalize.
Yeah. I think we've all heard the concerns about the blockchain bros, and it is an industry where a lot of wealth is already in the hands of men, and the companies are also male-dominated, which is not unlike the rest of tech. I think it's a super exciting industry that women should be a part of and not shy away from that. And I'm sure you're one of those kick-ass women who's out there exploring it. And I've actually met quite a few women in the crypto industry who are really doing some cool things. I know that Coinbase, this is something that Coinbase has been thinking about, and they do have a head of diversity and inclusion because I was on a panel with him, and he's pretty awesome. And so I think just like any other company, these are companies that need to be thoughtful about these things and thoughtful about them early on, because the bigger you are, the harder it is to change.
Hi, I'm a huge fan of both of you, so thank you so much for being here. I work at a company where the 2 female managers are in recruiting and people operations, myself. And I think that is often the space where we see more women in tech companies. As our company grows, we're obviously trying to improve our diversity and inclusion efforts. And that is within the realm of my job in people operations. Obviously, it is within the realm of recruiting. And so the 2 women become de facto leaders of this. What sort of tips do you have for us to, I guess, approach our male counterparts and get their buy-in and get them to, accept a lot of leadership in this space, even though it may fall within our job descriptions?
Yeah. So first of all, I think for any company to be successful about this, the CEO needs to embrace it and to empower the people like you who are responsible for changing it. I think data is really important here. And, I've talked a lot about hiring, but retention's actually a bad word because it's like retaining water. Progression, making sure that the women that you have want to stay and feel like they have opportunities for advancement. Women are twice as likely to quit tech as men, and they're not leaving to take care of families or, for personal reasons. They're leaving for jobs in other fields. And so that's a complete myth. And so making sure that you have that data so that you can see, well, hey, but look, women are leaving. That's really not good for our company, I think is a good way to try to get folks like that on side. And the other thing is building that structure into the organization. I keep going back to Slack, that's just because it's, the most detailed bright spot that I've explored. But they've diversified their recruiting team, and they've got a recruiting captain of every shape and size, and they're sourcing from underrepresented schools and different geographic locations, and their motto is work hard and go home. They're trying to create a place where people can do great work, but also have a life. One of the other dangers, I think, is work lives bleeding into personal lives, and in Silicon Valley that happens almost, I think, more than anywhere. And people of all ages are not necessarily comfortable with that. And so creating an environment where people can build careers over the course of a long time is really important. It's a war for talent, as you know. And you want, it's so much easier to recruit those women if you have women already at the table.
Hi, I'm Vivian Wei. Thank you so much for bringing so much energy to this conversation.
Thank you.
I want to focus a little bit on women's transition to motherhood, because starting the pipeline is one thing, but keeping all the women in the company is another. And I notice ambitious women hide our pregnancies, and when we come back, we used to have all this growth trajectories, but we're told, oh, okay, your growth is not here anymore. You need to find a different role or a different company or something, right? So what's your advice on kind of combating this maternal wall bias?
Right. Well, I've had 3 children, so I have some personal experience, and I've experienced all of those feelings. I think that having managers and leaders who make it clear that parents, moms and dads, are welcomed and celebrated is really important. So when I would leave a little bit early to pick up my kids, and I'd always feel guilty. And then our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, sent this big memo about diversity and how some people have kids and they might need to leave early to pick them up, and that's okay because we want parents to work here. And I get back online at night, and I work really hard, and I work on weekends, and I work when it works for me. And that work after hours that needs to be valued. And just I still feel guilty. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say it's perfect, and I always sort of feel like I'm going like this, but just him saying that makes me feel 25% less guilty, and that's really nice. But I think we should also realize, like, dads have kids too. And in the book, I actually interviewed Brett Taylor, who, he was the CTO of Facebook, and he talks about how, when Mark Zuckerberg would ask him to go to a dinner meeting, he's like, I couldn't say no, it was Mark Zuckerberg. And that was really hard on my wife, and we were, our children were being born. And so when he went on to start his next company, Quip, he made it clear that, at 5:30, they go home, they don't serve dinner, there's no expectation that you stay. But, he'd get back online at night, and he wouldn't be sending emails. He's like, I almost would do it secretly, because I wouldn't want people to feel like because I was online, they had to be. But this is about creating a good environment for parents in general, and I think it's important to realize that creating workspaces where people feel like they can do that is good for men and women. And that said, like, we're not just talking about parents. Maybe you have a plant to water, or you have a dog, or you want to go surfing or take a run. Like, people need to be able to have lives, friends, outside of work.
And this is a good segue for me to say, let's take one more question, because Emily needs to pick up her son after this from summer camp.
Yes.
So one last question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Emily. My name is Joanna. I'm an intern at Redfin, actually, and so I quite recently went through the college recruiting process for tech, and it meant a lot to me that companies like Facebook and things like that were raising their percentage of women in engineering from something like 20 to 30 to now 36%. But at the same time, it was definitely an insecurity of mine, and I know an insecurity of a lot of other people, of my friends that were going through the same process, that it's awesome that I'm getting all these job offers and interviews and things like that, but these companies are just trying to raise their numbers from 20 to 30%. What if I'm only getting these interviews and getting these offers because I am a woman and because they want to raise those numbers? I would really love to hear what you would tell a young woman who might feel insecure that they're being hired as a quota, and also what you might tell companies to help make these young women that are being hired understand you're not just a quota.
Yep. So I got asked that question, and I realized in the moment I have a personal story here. So when I graduated from college, I had this amazing interview at a huge news organization, and I was so excited. And I go into the interview, and it's this round table of 12 people, and someone said, "How do you feel about being part of a diversity program?" And I was like, it was like a dagger to my heart. I had no idea it was a diversity program. And I was like, oh, that's why I'm here. Okay. But you know what? I took the job and I kicked ass. And so I proved that I deserve to be there. And that's what you need to do. I think a lot of these companies are trying, and that's great. It is great that they're trying. And who knows what the reasons are? Maybe it's not the right reasons for anyone who watches The Bachelor. But I almost don't think it matters, because once you get in there and you kill it and you show that you deserve to be there and you belong, and you can help to change things for the next person that gets hired. So, you know, I think intentions are important. And some of these companies are probably doing these things because they're under public pressure, but ultimately, if it gets the numbers to a better place, that's when we have a real culture shift, and that's what needs to happen. Break down those walls, girl.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having me.